The outbreak of World War I in 1914 brought about one of the most tumultuous periods in world history. This was a period of war, revolution, and counter-revolution. And Germany was really at the center of this world history for a lot of reasons, but I think it's really impossible to get a sense of how the world situation developed without an understanding of the German Revolution. It was this revolution that ended World War I, had the potential to break the Soviet Union out of its isolation, and the defeat of the revolution would lay the groundwork for Hitler's rise to power and the degeneration of the Soviet Union under Stalin. But before the outbreak of World War I, there was a period of relative stability. Over the course of the 19th century, Germany had grown from a loose confederation of independent states into a massive empire. The German Empire was a monarchy led by the Kaiser Wilhelm II at the head of a government backed by a powerful landed aristocracy and a massive state. The German parliament, or the Reichstag, had little power compared to the Kaiser and effectively just existed to pass a budget. It was in this situation that the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or the SPD, was founded in 1875. This party was created as an eclectic grouping of two different workers' parties. One was composed of revolutionary communists who were under the influence of Marx and Engels, and another was led by Ferdinand Lassalle, who advocated for achieving socialism through universal suffrage and parliament. These groups were united by the equally eclectic Gotha program, which was a thoroughly reformist document that Marx had some words about. But fundamentally, the competing tendencies within this party were united against the monarchy and capitalism. The SPD actually achieved immediate success, growing rapidly, winning elections. This prompted the Kaiser to crack down, passing anti-socialist laws which illegalized the work of the SPD. The police would break up their meetings, would break up their print shops, carry out arrests and deportations. But this actually resulted in more growth for the young SPD. Votes for candidates more than quadrupled to over 1.4 million during this period, and the laws would later be repealed. And the growth of the SPD was taking place during a period of mass industrialization and capitalist boom. Germany was on the cutting edge of technology and the organization of production at scale. And by the outbreak of World War I, Germany actually had surpassed Britain as the largest industrial economy in Europe, with 2/3 of the population living in cities and 3/4 of the country proletarianized. During this period, the Kaiser actually passed the world's first welfare policies. He passed policies for sick pay, industrial accidents, and created the first pension system. And these reforms were totally paternalistic and were ultimately meant to blunt the edge of the growing socialist movement. But this was a period where the state could actually afford to make concessions to the working class that were in their benefit. And it was in this upswing that the political contradictions within the SPD started to sharpen. I think this is best represented by the ideas of Edward Bernstein, who, having lived through 20 years of peaceful capitalist development, decided to launch a full frontal attack on Marxism from within the SPD. Bernstein argued that capitalist society could continue to evenly develop, and that socialism is not an economic necessity, but a moral choice of people independent of their economic and social position. Bernstein thought that the capitalists could be convinced of the moral superiority of socialism and join the revolution too. The SPD leadership would actually welcome Bernstein's attack on Marxism as just another perspective. They didn't want open debate to threaten the unity of the party, but these attacks would spill into discussions over what program the SPD should forward. A growing reformist tendency, represented by Bernstein and many of the trade unionists, argued for a minimum program of day-to-day achievable reforms. The leadership of the SPD couldn't reckon this idea of a minimum program to the maximum program of socialist revolution. So they ultimately compromised, breaking their program into two parts, one for the minimum demands and one for the maximum. And it was the young revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg that actually had total clarity on this question. She directly attacked Bernstein and raised the point that the whole party should be engaged in this debate, not just the leadership. She proposed her own interpretation of the minimum and maximum demands, saying that this problem of reform or revolution was meaningless because the struggle for reforms in their end could only have a revolutionary conclusion. And this debate would be decisively resolved by her landmark pamphlet, Reform or Revolution, where I think she sweeps Bernstein into the dustbin of history where he belongs and decisively orients the forces of social democracy back towards genuine Marxism. Reform or Revolution is a strikingly relevant pamphlet today and something that I think everyone should read because we encounter many of the same arguments that Rosa Luxemburg was encountering. But unfortunately, Luxemburg's theoretical prowess was not enough to change the tides of the SPD. because this party was a behemoth. It was the pride of organized socialism. By 1912, the SPD was the largest party in Germany. It had 1 million members, 4 million voters, 90 daily newspapers, a huge network of parallel organizations, associations of socialist women, of youth wings, people's universities, libraries, even leisure organizations. The party had sort of taken on a life of its own, like a socialist society within capitalism. And I think you can see how under these circumstances, it makes sense how two drastically opposed political viewpoints could exist in the same party. But with this came a layer of academics, of liberals, and career politicians who entered into the SPD and really had no interest in revolution. They were fundamentally content with the existing order of things. This looming threat of opportunism was not just isolated to the German SPD, but was everywhere. The Second International, or the Socialist International, had been established in 1889 and held an explicitly Marxist position on paper, opposing war, colonialism, and class compromise, but in practice had experienced much of the same degeneration under the pressures of capitalist upswing that the SPD had. And while these contradictions were forming in the socialist movement, they were also sharpening within German capitalism. At this point, 5 large banks dominated economic activity in Germany, and these banks would increasingly fuse themselves with industrial capital and the state, more so than anywhere else in Europe. Smaller capitalists had been effectively displaced, monopolizing production in a fewer and fewer number of hands. And this monster of German capital would continue to storm the world's markets. But this rapid development was taking place in a period where most of the world had already been conquered. The colonial powers of the world had divided it amongst themselves, and Germany was late to the stage, finding fewer and fewer markets to exploit. This was the epoch of imperialism, which I think German capitalism really embodied in a lot of ways. And when the capitalists of the world cannot negotiate the terms of their expansions in boardrooms, they resort to politics by other means, or war. And the SPD and the parties of the Second International saw the writing on the wall. They saw a naval arms race, the creation of new alliances and defense pacts, and so engaged in a huge anti-militarist campaign, right? Leaflets were written, resolutions were passed, papers were printed, but this would all disappear on the outset of war. On August 1st, 1914, the German government would declare war on Russia. The very next day, the executive of the SPD would meet to discuss the question of voting for a war budget, because that's basically all they could do in the Reichstag. And there was fierce debate, but the right wing would win. The SPD leadership was fundamentally scared of the Kaiser. They were afraid if they opposed the war, they would be banned. They would lose the gains they had made in the last period. They were afraid of losing their cushy positions within the party, and also caved to the chauvinist propaganda of the German state, calling the war defensive and protecting the German people against Russian Tsarism. They also thought the war would be short and easy, and they could return to business afterwards. The vote within the SPD was 78 against 14, and the opposition would not break party discipline. The following day in the Reichstag, the SPD voted unanimously in support for the coming war and was met by roaring applause. And this was absolutely catastrophic. The SPD was the largest party in the Second International and the political center of it in many ways. And this decision had an immediate ripple effect, prompting socialist parties all over Europe to line up behind their own ruling classes in support of the war. First was France, and then Belgium, and then Britain. Lenin saw a copy of the Vorwärts magazine, which is the main SPD newspaper, which declared support for the war and thought it was a forgery. In a single day, the SPD had gone from an uncompromising stance against the war to abandoning the class struggle in favor of a political truce with the monarchy. And with this decision, the SPD had killed the Second International as a tool for world revolution, and the forces of Marxism were now scattered and facing down a world on fire. World War I would rage for more than 4 years, and there are really no words to describe the brutality. While the generals sat in planning rooms and the capitalists reaped in astronomical profits, the working class was slaughtered en masse by disease, malnutrition, artillery, and poison gas. In one day of the Battle of Somme, the British forces suffered 57,000 casualties and 20,000 killed for 3 miles of territory. It's estimated that throughout the duration of the war, there were 40 million casualties of both civilians and soldiers. In Germany, 2 million soldiers would be killed, and the British naval blockade, conscription of agricultural workers, and the use of fertilizer for explosives would cause between 400,000 and 800,000 Germans to die of hunger and malnutrition. At the onset of the war, the SPD and the German trade unions actually agreed to suspend the class struggle against the German capitalists. They signed an agreement with employers that banned strikes, that banned lockouts for the duration of the war. The Kaiser had actually made plans to arrest key trade unionists and key social democrats, but this proved unnecessary. The Kaiser said, "I know no more parties, I only know Germans." However, under the surface, a small anti-war sentiment would take root and begin to grow. The first to move were the most politically advanced Marxists within the SPD, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Liebknecht was the son of one of the founders of the SPD and was a skilled agitator. And while not much of a theoretician, he was decisively anti-war and saw the errors of the SPD's decision basically as soon as it happened. He would craft the slogan, "The main enemy is at home," which would be later taken up by Lenin. And this grouping was the embryo of what would become the Spartacist League. By December of 1914, Liebknecht was attempting to win over other SPD deputies to the fight, and within a year, 43 of the 108 SPD deputies would publicly break party discipline and oppose the war. Both Liebknecht and Luxemburg would be arrested during this time for their anti-war sentiments and would stay in prison until the end of the war. But this sentiment that this anti-war root would spread all over the country in the form of strikes and really take root in the rank and file of the SPD. On March 1916, a significant number of SPD deputies refused to vote for the budget. The SPD would then begin a witch hunt to drive out anyone not adhering to the party line from the party. Editorial boards were purged, deputies were expelled. The SPD would try to tear off any part of their party that was opposing the war. And all of the people expelled would actually form an independent social democratic party for Germany, or the USPD. They would organize with an initial grouping of 120,000 members. The Spartacist League at this time had fully formed into an independent group, although still very loosely organized. They would also join the USPD as an independent organization. Rosa Luxemburg would be smuggling letters out of prison at this time to sort of craft the party line. Another key political grouping that was sort of forming during this period were the revolutionary shop stewards. The shop stewards, unlike trade union bureaucrats, were actually workers on factory floors. They were the natural leaders of the working class, elected directly by the workers they represented. And they were watching as conditions in Germany eroded over the course of the war. At this point, the trade unions were totally disarmed in Germany, and meetings would often be attended by the police or state officials to make sure there was no disruption to the war effort. And as a result, these shop stewards would gather and talk strategy and politics outside of union meetings where they couldn't be listened to. The revolutionary shop stewards would coalesce into a group based on these sort of informal connections. And while they had an excellent understanding of the mood on the ground and could easily gauge the efficacy of a potential strike, they were thoroughly pragmatic and really only willing to struggle if they were certain of victory. And they were also really at first only interested in the economic struggle for better conditions. This group would also join the USPD. And this organization, the USPD, I think is a really instructive example of a centrist organization, a working class party which has competing tendencies from reformism to revolution. And Bernstein would join this party, along with many others, but as Marxists, it's really important to understand the direction that a party like this is developing in. In this case, while it's totally clear that the reformist tendency held a huge amount of sway within the party, it was being pushed to the left by revolutionary events. The forces of genuine Marxism within a party like this can use it as a base for winning over wider layers of support, influencing events at a larger scale, and also getting a degree of protection from being part of a mass party like this. The USPD would consolidate its forces, and the news of the 1917 February Revolution in Russia would send shockwaves through the class struggle in Germany. The Russian masses had brought down the Tsar by popular uprising and established Soviets of workers and peasants. Waves of strikes would follow across Germany, especially in the munitions industry, and this was really a hotbed for class struggle. The war had sidelined much of the existing leadership of the working class. They had sent them to the front lines or to prison. They had blunted their unions, but also had concentrated the workers in these massive industries and made conditions uniform across them. And this had a radicalizing effect, especially as the war dragged on with workers mounting strikes everywhere without a clear leadership. But it was the October Revolution that would decisively turn the tide in Germany. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had swept aside the reformist provisional government and proved the potential of a genuine workers' government in practice. The Bolsheviks would put forward a genuine internationalist position and immediately call for an end to the war. They appealed to the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, producing a newspaper in German and printing 500,000 copies of each issue to be distributed to the front lines and smuggled into German cities. In January of 1918, more than 1 million factory workers across the entire munitions industry would go on strike. And the strike was led by the head of the revolutionary shop stewards, Richard Mueller. The workers and their leaders learned in practice that their economic demands could not be met while the war raged on, so instead entered into the political struggle. The strike would demand an end to the war, peace without annexation, universal suffrage, and the establishment of a republic. Because conditions in Germany at this point were absolutely brutal. Meat consumption was down to 12% of its pre-war level, infant mortality was up 50%, and adult consumption was at just 1,000 calories a day. The front line was collapsing, and Germany would suffer 240,000 casualties in just 15 days between March and April. Things were really coming apart at the seam, and strikes would rage on through the year. The regime would try to sue for peace, because this was more honorable than accepting defeat, but this would decisively fail. And on November 2nd, 1918, a joint meeting of the USPD leadership, along with the shop stewards and the Spartacus, was called. Germany was clearly entering into a revolutionary situation, and these leaders would take up the question of planning an insurrection. An army officer would attend this meeting and offer the support of his soldiers and arms. Some called for an insurrection in 2 days on the 4th. Others would call for it on the 11th. At the end, the committee would conclude by just deciding to call for a general strike and see what happens. But a revolution cannot be made on schedule. And the next day, November the 3rd, the German workers and sailors would storm onto the scene of history, and the revolution would begin. A few days prior to this, the German High Command had ordered a decisive naval battle in the North Sea. This was a suicide mission to save the honor of the generals who ordered it, and the sailors stationed at port knew this. A mutiny would start aboard 2 battleships at the port of Kiel. Sailors refused to lift anchor and go into battle, and this mutiny would spread like wildfire, quickly involving the entire German Navy. In Kiel, 20,000 sailors surged through the streets waving red flags and driving commandeered trucks. They would be met in the city by cheering workers, and together they would storm the armories, seizing any weapons they could find, and release political prisoners. Agitators would deliver speeches calling for an end to the war and an end to the monarchy. It was absolutely incredible. And whenever these mass meetings were called, whenever people would congregate, they would naturally elect delegates or committees to lead. These councils, which are synonymous with Soviets, are not an invention of the communists or anyone else, but are a totally organic expression of proletarian consciousness. The working class naturally coming together to form a leadership and to solve problems. The Soviet represents genuine workers' democracy. Elected delegates were directly accountable and a subject to immediate recall by mass meeting, not because those rules were written down anywhere, but because it just makes sense. And this revolution would spread inland with very similar results. Workers, soldiers, and sailors, inspired by reports of revolution on the coast, would seize power themselves and establish councils. In Leipzig, the Spartacus had a small group of only about 25 comrades who would try to persuade the local USPD leadership into joining the revolution, but were rejected. On that very same day, revolutionary sailors would pour onto the streets, winning over the soldiers stationed in town, and would declare a Soviet. By the 9th of November, the revolution had reached Berlin. Leaflets calling for an insurrection had been distributed at every workplace the night before, and in the morning, the revolutionary workers would sweep across the streets. There's a great report of a crowd of Berlin workers meeting an armed patrol, and the workers hold up signs that say, like, "Brothers, don't shoot," and the soldiers would proceed to lay down their arms and start marching with the revolution. There was an intense mood of jubilation and victory on the ground. There were sparse pockets of resistance, mostly comprised of Army and Navy officers, but these would be swept to the side, usually without a bullet being fired. There was really no need for vigilante justice when spirits were so high. And in less than a week, the revolution had swept across the entire country. The German state was still trying to figure out what to do. Just before the revolution had erupted, the state had created a new parliamentary government led by the Kaiser's cousin, Prince Max von Baden. the imperial government would fill this body with loyal SPD members, the most pro-war, the most establishment SPD members, to hopefully ease the transition in the face of the coming revolution, because they were social democrats after all. And this government would masquerade as liberal and progressive, but really was indistinguishable from the past government besides its composition. When the revolution began, this government had to quickly figure out what they were going to do. They had to devise a strategy to respond. Repression wouldn't work because the army was split along class lines and was becoming increasingly unreliable. Not to mention there were millions of workers on the streets at this point. But the German capitalists could not tolerate the rule of Soviets, so something had to be done. And the first hint of this strategy would come with an SPD deputy, Gustav Noske, being sent by Prince Max von Baden. He was sent to Kiel to see the situation firsthand. And when he arrived, he was greeted by roaring applause. He was a leading social democrat after all. And at this point, the majority of the population still saw the social democrats as standing for genuine social democracy. Noske was appointed as governor of Kiel, and on one hand, immediately recognized the political authority of the Workers' and Sailors' Council there. He really had no choice. But on the other hand, worked tirelessly to stifle the revolution. He would successfully restore the chain of military command and bring the officers back to their posts and regain order in the street. And this mission was really a decisive victory for the capitalists. The imperial government needed to buy time, and at this point, the balance of forces was clearly in the favor of the workers. The state had no reliable armies to send against them, and so the capitalist strategy would be to stifle the progress of the revolution as much as possible to prevent the masses from decisively taking power. The next step for the German state was to topple the monarchy themselves, actually. Prince Max von Baden would approach the SPD leader Friedrich Ebert and say, if I should succeed in persuading the Kaiser to abdicate, so I have you on my side in the battle against the social revolution. Ebert, the social democrat, would reply, if the Kaiser does not abdicate, the social revolution is inevitable. I do not want it. In fact, I hate it like sin. Prince Max von Baden would go on to say, the revolution is on the verge of winning. We cannot crush it, but perhaps we can strangle it. If Ebert is presented to me from the streets as the people's leader, then we will have a republic. If it is Liebknecht, then Bolshevism. Perhaps it will be possible to divert the revolutionary energies into the legal channels of an election campaign. And this is exactly what they would do. Ebert would be tasked with repeating Noske's success only for the entirety of Germany. On the 9th of November, the same day as the revolution reached Berlin, von Baden would announce the abdication of the Kaiser and the end of the monarchy. The SPD, led by Ebert, would be placed at the head of a new government and tasked with restoring order. As the masses of workers assembled outside the Reichstag building, an SPD deputy would stick his head out and declare a republic to roaring applause. This was the nature in Berlin. And at this point, Berlin and all of Germany really hung in a state of dual power. On one hand, there were waves of armed revolutionary workers and sailors and soldiers occupying buildings, establishing Soviets, electing leadership, and there was no force to stop them. The Reichstag building was occupied without a shot being fired, and political prisoners, including Rosa Luxemburg, were freed. But on the other hand, you have a newly formed SPD government that's scrambling to restore order. At this point, really, with a clear revolutionary leadership, the councils could have decisively taken power themselves. This was the situation, but the mood on the ground was that the revolution was over and was a decided victory. There were so many people on the street that they thought they had won, while the factories and the banks remained in the hands of the capitalists. And on November 10th, a meeting of the Berlin Workers' and Soldiers' Councils would proclaim itself representative of the revolutionary masses. And this body would create two different committees. On one hand, an executive council, which was led by Richard Müller, who's the head of the Revolutionary Shop Stewards, and another committee, the Council of People's Deputies, which was led by Ebert. The USPD would join Ebert's government, and while Müller would fight for a Soviet republic in the Executive Council. And on paper, Ebert's Council of People's Deputies was to be held accountable to the Executive Council and by extension all of the Soviets. But remember that at this point, Ebert had been appointed as Supreme Chancellor by the falling monarchy, and according to the Constitution, executive power still rests in his hands. So in this move, the same man was at the head of both the revolution and the counter-revolution. Ebert's government would have both the authority of the Soviets and the bourgeois state and would immediately move into action. First came a series of necessary concessions. An armistice would end the war. A declaration was issued recognizing the right to freedom of assembly and expression. There was amnesty for political prisoners, the 8-hour workday, I could go on. And on that very same day, the Ebert government would consolidate the old imperial administrators and functionaries into his government, and then turn to the German high command, the generals, and assure them that the chain of command would stay in effect. He would actually call for their help in preventing disorder and mutiny within the army. The SPD would also launch a massive propaganda campaign to pose themselves as the party of unity and to circulate the word of all of the gracious reforms that they had given. In this situation, you can see that as soon as the forces of revolution take their foot off the gas, the counter-revolution will begin to organize. The German bourgeoisie and their parties, who had just supported the Kaiser, would rebrand as liberal Democrats and begin to strategize about how to get their foot in the door of the new government. And this strategy would fundamentally hinge on the question of a national assembly. The Spartakists and the shop stewards, with Mueller in the lead, knew the dangers of this, right? Power could be taken by the Soviets at this point, and a national assembly would leave the door open for the bourgeois parties and the SPD to consolidate their forces and mount an offensive on the electoral front. However, the masses fundamentally supported a national assembly. This was a progressive demand under the monarchy and was seen as a democratic way to rebuild the government in the wake of revolution. This question would come to a head at the first National Congress of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, which was held at the end of December 1918. This Congress was composed of delegates from all over Germany, but was dominated by the SPD. Their propaganda campaign had worked, and they leveraged their massive party apparatus to win the majority of the Soviets. This was made easier by the composition of the National Congress. Just 187 out of 488 delegates would be wage workers, and the USPD would only have 90 delegates present. After 5 days of debate, the Congress would decide to call a National Assembly and support a parliamentary democracy. It would dissolve the Executive Council led by Mueller and firmly place Ebert and the Council of People's Commissars in charge until the National Assembly could be called. This was a political suicide for the Soviets. They had voted their power away in favor of bourgeois democracy, which would bring the first period of the revolution to a close. And as Marxists, we always adapt our tactics to the concrete objective situation. The Spartakists were a tiny group at this point with little political influence. The USPD was split on the question of a National Assembly, and the SPD had won the decisive majority in the Soviets. So given this situation, it was necessary for the forces of Marxism to orient towards the National Assembly, aiming to win the majority of the Soviets and prove the necessity of completing the revolution in practice. Instead, the Spartakists would endlessly decry the decisions of the Congress. They would organize demonstrations against it, and they would walk out of the Congress en masse. This was a huge tactical mistake that served to further isolate the revolutionary leadership from the masses. And comrades, ultra-leftism is turning secondary questions into matters of principle. It imposes a fixed schema on living events and impatiently refuses to meet current consciousness as it is and pushes for a perfect and abstract revolutionary program. And Lenin called ultra-leftism an infantile disorder, not as like an empty insult, but because it rises out of the inexperience of the leadership. I mean, imagine being part of this Congress and watching the Soviets vote their power into the hands of Ebert. I would be beside myself in anger. And you can see why the genuine revolutionaries would march out, but we cannot let emotion dictate our actions. And at this point, it was necessary for the genuine revolutionaries to consolidate their forces and reorient the party to the task at hand. By the end of December, Berlin was still in the hands of the workers. There were strikes and demonstrations all over the city. The People's Naval Division, which was comprised of revolutionary sailors from Kiel, had arrived in Berlin to defend the revolution. They patrolled the streets and would clash with government forces who were trying to smash the revolution. The People's Naval Division had stationed themselves at the Imperial Palace in Berlin. The government saw them as a clear threat, so mounted an offensive, first demanding their withdrawal and then launching a military operation against them. They would open fire with machine guns and artillery. The fighting would rage on for 2 days. And as the battle dragged on, armed workers, along with the newly created revolutionary police force in Berlin, would actually join the sailors and beat back the government forces. As this sort of went on, the government forces would become increasingly unreliable, laying down their weapons to desert or even joining the revolutionary sailors. The fighting would fizzle out for a victory for the sailors at the cost of dozens of casualties on both sides. But this event would cause a deep rift within the government. The USPD would leave Ebert's government to protest the bloodbath. They couldn't tolerate being in a government that would open fire on the sailors. But fundamentally, there was no reckoning for this attack, right? I think this is really a crucial lesson that when our class enemies are going to take every opportunity they can to defend their system. And as soon as we have the advantage, we need to move decisively and not give them a second to breathe. When the forces of counter-revolution show themselves, it's our task to immediately move against them, not to wait around and hope they don't come back, but to crush them. And we'll see the consequences of not doing this in Germany, because for the generals and the SPD leadership, this loss was unacceptable. Ordinary soldiers had proved to be entirely unreliable and easily won over to the revolution. And this prompted Ebert to look elsewhere for an armed base to enforce order. In this, he would build up a dedicated counter-revolutionary force. And this took the form of the Freikorps. These were paramilitary and ultra-reactionary gangs, groups of officers and soldiers, many of whom had experience killing Bolsheviks in the Baltics. They would be funded by the German capitalists who were interested in crushing the revolution and were actively being recruited by Ebert's government at this point. The Freikorps would be the first seeds of fascism in Germany. The plan had worked, and Ebert had successfully diverted the revolution long enough for the capitalists to find their footing. The consequences of this would be absolutely horrific. Ebert rapidly replaced the USPD ministers that had resigned with SPD members and appointed Gustav Noske, the guy who blunted the revolution in Kiel, as Minister of Defense. He would strengthen the SPD's relationship with the German High Command and effectively have the Freikorps at his disposal. The SPD would unite the right wing against the forces of Bolshevism and launch a witch hunt against the Spartacist League. And while the Spartakists at this point were still a tiny group, and they played a courageous but relatively minor role in the November Revolution, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were well known all throughout Germany. They would be associated with German Bolshevism. They would be the faces of German Bolshevism. The SPD and their lackeys would print posters and leaflets and newspapers accusing them of starting a bloody revolt and plunging the city into chaos. These papers would also call for their murder. While this was happening, the Spartakists were watching the successes of the Bolshevik Party in Russia, and they were also watching the political fissures within the USPD and how it clearly wasn't a force for revolution. But the working class needed a bold and decisive leadership now more than ever, and the Spartakists were committed to transforming themselves into that leadership by force. They would break from the USPD and form an independent communist party built on the model of the Bolsheviks. This party was called the KPD and was founded on December 30th, 1918. And forming an independent party at this point was not a principled question. It could be argued that it was a necessary step, but there were also deep consequences to this decision that Rosa Luxemburg would immediately identify. The Spartakists were still a small organization, only a few thousand members across Germany, and while having an incredibly capable leadership, the overall political level of the group was very low. Ultra-leftism was rampant within the ranks of the Spartakists, and breaking from the USPD would further isolate the party from the rest of the left and from the working class as a whole. The revolutionary shop stewards would attend the founding congress of the KPD looking to join, but would leave empty-handed. The shop stewards would demand open work within the trade unions and the parliament, which the ultra-lefts of the KPD would deem thoroughly reactionary bodies and refuse on principle. Luxemburg would fight against this, but was outvoted. The shop stewards really could have given the isolated party a mass base, but with this decision, Germany's most politically conscious communists and its most effective labor organizers failed to join forces to the detriment of them both. The KPD would have no time to really consolidate its forces, as in January, the situation in Berlin would explode once again. This would center around Emil Eichhorn, who was the revolutionary chief of police in Berlin. Eichhorn was not a cop. He was a journalist who was heavily involved with the SPD and just happened to lead the occupation of the police headquarters. He found himself elected as police chief. He had 2,000 armed workers and soldiers committed to the revolution behind him and had spent the last months guarding the revolution from the army and the other reactionary forces. Eichhorn and any other armed organization of workers really was a clear and immediate threat to Ebert's government and his plans to pacify the city, so something had to be done. And on January 4th of 1919, Eichhorn was dismissed from his post by the SPD based on a series of false charges. And he would refuse to step down. The USPD, Revolutionary Shop Stewards, and KPD would immediately come out in support of him, calling for mass demonstrations. 500,000 Berlin workers would come to Eichhorn's defense. This was more than were on the street during the November Revolution. An emergency revolutionary committee was formed, composed of a staggering 50 members of the various leaders. The committee quickly realized the potential of the situation. Berlin's garrison, as well as military support from other German cities, would be on their side. And with this knowledge, the Revolutionary Committee decided that this was the time to move against the Ebert-led government and to take power. The mood on the streets was that the Second Revolution had come. So many people had come out that elements of the military and had abandoned their posts, and SPD leaders had all left their government buildings for fear of the revolution picking them up. This committee, the Revolutionary Committee, would go into permanent session, and there was intense debate over what should happen next. A section of the committee argued for a defensive action, saying that while the mood in Berlin was incredible, the majority of Germany was still under the influence of the SPD, and even if the workers in Berlin could oust the Ebert government, they would be starved out by the capitalists controlling the countryside. This was the official position of the KPD and one that Rosa Luxemburg was firm on. She was unfortunately not on the Revolutionary Committee. Another side of the committee said that retreat at this point, given all of the workers on the street, would be seen as a terrible defeat, and the best way to consolidate their forces was to go on the offensive, smashing Ebert's government and taking power. The immense tragedy of the situation is that neither tactic would be put into action. The Revolutionary Committee would stay in session for 2 whole days and would not give any clear instruction to the workers. 500,000 on the street, armed and waiting for orders, standing for hours in the rain, watching entire days pass, while their leaders sat in meetings and endlessly deliberated. The masses cannot wait in a state of readiness indefinitely, and by the 3rd day, the energy had ebbed. Workers started to go home, the armed elements of the revolution started to break off and demobilize, and initiative was totally lost. The leadership had an opportunity to raise the horizons of the Berlin workers and point the way forward. Instead, the committee killed any revolutionary potential themselves. And as soon as the workers lost the initiative and the movement ebbed, the counter-revolution would attack decisively. They displayed a far greater degree of centralism and organization. Noske would deploy the Freikorps into the streets of Berlin, backed up by heavy artillery and mortar fire. The occupied Vorwärts building would be retaken after hours of artillery barrage. The rebels would fly the white flag to surrender, but were promptly put up against the wall and shot by the Freikorps. Over the next days, the Freikorps would storm through the streets of Berlin, brutally putting down any resistance by force. Hundreds would be killed in street battles and hundreds more arrested, suffering extreme mistreatment if they weren't immediately executed. On January 8th, 4 days after the uprising had broken out, the Revolutionary Committee would declare the revolution a failure and enter into negotiations with Ebert's government. But they had no leverage at this point. Ebert would demand unconditional surrender, and the Revolutionary Committee was unable to agree on a retreat plan, so would splinter, totally scattering the forces that they had left. The SPD would intensify its propaganda campaign. This uprising would be solely attributed to the Spartakists, and its failure would be blamed on them. In reality, the KPD had little influence on the uprising, and it would have happened with or without them. It was a movement from below, really representing the deep dissatisfaction with the Ebert regime in Berlin, and exploded spontaneously over this question of Eichhorn. But the name Spartacus and their leaders, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, would make the perfect target for Noske and his troops. Noske would give permission to shoot any Spartacus member on sight and would put a bounty out for the arrest of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. At this point, the people closest to the two would persuade them to go into hiding, but they would stay in Berlin, refusing to leave the struggle behind. It was too late, and on the night of January 15th, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht would both be tracked down to their safe houses and were murdered. This was an incredible tragedy. In one night, the KPD had lost its best political leader and most prestigious speaker. Marxists do not deny the role of the individual in history, and these two were really exceptional leaders. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were known to every German worker and much of the international movement. Their murder would behead the revolution, and while struggle would continue without them, their loss would ripple across Germany and the entire international. The counter-revolution would push its initiative. The SPD would declare martial law, and Noske would launch a civil war against any form of workers' power. This is what we mean when we say betrayal is inherent in reformism. In Germany, it was the reformists of the SPD who would go to any length to maintain the domination of capital over labor. They had organized the mass slaughter of revolutionaries, and now the SPD would allow the Freikorps to sweep across Germany, murdering without consequence. The Freikorps, with backing of the government troops, would crush the Bremen Council Republic in the northwest of Germany and the Bavarian Soviet Republic in the south. In Berlin, the People's Naval Division were told they would receive final pay, but it was a trap. They would be lured and shot. The KPD was forced underground, the revolutionary shop stewards would disband, and the majority of the Soviets would be destroyed by Noska's troops. The revolution had been put down. The long-awaited National Assembly would be held on January 19th in a state of total military repression. The assembly would create the Weimar Republic. A constitution would be drafted and touted as the most democratic in the world. And it was within the legal framework of this constitution that Hitler would rise to power and dissolve the parliament. The petty bourgeois that would later become the mass base of fascism would celebrate the temporary peace and stability that the Freikorps had brought. But in doing this, the SPD had ultimately sowed the seeds of its own destruction. They had created a force that they could not control. And the alliance between the reformists and the capitalists, the forces of reaction, the generals and the Freikorps, was one of pure convenience. And as soon as the SPD stopped being useful, it would be discarded. In early 1920, Noska would actually try to disband one of the most brutal Freikorps units, but the general stationed in Berlin would refuse, turn around, and demand the dissolution of the National Assembly. 12,000 Freikorps troops would march into the capital and declare a military government. The SPD ministers would flee from Berlin en masse, abandoning the workers behind them. This was called the Kapp Putsch. Kapp was the dictator they tried to install, and Putsch is basically a coup. A call for a strike was issued, and the workers responded so decisively that Berlin was completely paralyzed within the same day. The call was made to open fire on the striking workers, but the officers knew better than to shoot at such an overwhelming force for fear of sparking a civil war. The call for a general strike would be taken up all over the country, and the workers would put down the coup in a matter of days. Of course, the SPD happily negotiated with the orchestrators of the coup, and they would be returned to power and granted amnesty for all of the generals involved. The KPD at this point was reeling from the loss of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. The young and inexperienced Communist Party had lost its best and most politically advanced leaders, along with the countless that were killed or sitting in prison as a result of the previous period. This served to only deepen the ultra-left tendencies within the party. The KPD would actually oppose the nationwide general strike on the basis that the coup was a battle between two wings of the bourgeois. Can you imagine this? A nationwide general strike topples a military dictatorship, and you cross your arms and oppose it? The KPD would change their stance later, but ultra-leftism ran deep through the party, and these fissures would open up and explode in the next period. The Russian Revolution had sparked a wave of revolution and class struggle all throughout Europe. Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood the need for a genuine communist international based in the granite foundation of Marxist theory, so at this point they would form the Third International, the Comintern. This would be formed in March of 1919 to unite the forces of world revolution. In Germany, the political situation had polarized rapidly, like in much of the world. And the failed coup attempt meant support for the SPD would rapidly decline in favor of both the left and right-wing parties. The USPD and the KPD would both experience explosive growth and would both apply for membership in the new Communist International. This would actually provoke a huge split in the USPD with a significant amount of members leaving to join the SPD, and the rest would unite forces with the KPD, which after this development had a membership of about 500,000 workers. German communism finally had a mass party. This was actually the second largest party of the Comintern behind the Bolsheviks. But just like the SPD, you can have a huge membership and a massive party apparatus, but it can all be for nothing if you don't have the right ideas. And the lack of experienced Marxists within the KPD would prove decisive. A young and energetic layer with a one-sided and romantic vision of revolution would push the party into action, calling for an urgent battle against the government on the basis of all of their numerical gains. This would suit the growing bureaucracy within the Comintern, represented by chiefly Zinoviev. And I could talk all day about Zinoviev's methods, but fundamentally he relied on organizational solutions to resolve political problems. He leveraged authority and prestige to maneuver within the party. He would surround himself by yes men who wouldn't question orders, and he would ultimately develop tactics based on what was beneficial to him and his clique. Zinoviev was the president of the Comintern and would take a keen interest in Germany. It still had the potential at this point to break the isolation of the Soviet Union, and victory would prove a huge success for the Comintern. While Lenin at this point had his hands full with the Russian Civil War and the new economic policy, Zinoviev would develop the theory of the offensive, which said that the actions of the Communist Party could force the working class into revolutionary action. This adventurous policy would be enthusiastically taken up by the KPD, who were looking for any opportunity at this point to incite another revolution. And this opportunity would come in March 1921. In Saxony, the SPD had deployed the police against striking miners. The KPD would declare a general strike in response, and would also order the use of totally artificial means to draw the masses into struggle. They would blow up a workers' cooperative themselves and then blame it on the police. They would publish fake kidnappings of their own members in their newspapers. And the majority of the workers were sympathetic to the striking miners at this point, but the KPD didn't have a mass base and just failed to do any of the necessary preparations to make this general strike a success. It was just sort of declared from above, and the workers were expected to take up the call. And instead of realizing their mistake, the KPD doubled down. They occupied a dockyard and a massive nitrogen plant with rifles without the backing of the actual workers that were there. This was called the March Action, and it was a disaster. Military and police forces would flood into the area and crush the few pockets of resistance. Hundreds would die and thousands would be imprisoned. And this action would totally isolate the KPD from the working class. Around 200,000 members would leave or desert the KPD totally demoralized. What's even worse is that the KPD and Zinoviev would double down. They would turn to the Communist International and call the March Action a victory. They praised the methods used as fruitful and opening up new, broader revolutionary actions that they would break the party out of its isolation and passivity. This conclusion was accepted by the Executive Committee of the Communist International. And there are lots of parts of this history that just sort of had me beside myself in frustration. But this might be the worst because, comrades, we always have to learn the lessons of history and adapt our tactics accordingly. If we revise history for the purpose of our own prestige or clout, then we have no hope of developing successful tactics. Lenin and Trotsky would catch wind of the results of the March Action and would strike a decisive blow against it in the Third Congress of the Comintern. This was a pivotal Congress which was filled with fiery debate, but Lenin and Trotsky would point the way forward, identifying a clear change in the objective situation and the need for a turn towards united front work. This would actually be a huge benefit to the KPD and help them recruit and find their footing and maybe whittle away some of their ultra-leftism, but events would move rapidly. In 1923, the situation in Germany would explode again. The Treaty of Versailles, which had officially ended World War I, turned Germany into one of the weakest links in world capitalism. The burdens of debt owed to France and Britain and the US were unpayable, not just in money, but in industrial machines, iron, coal, and livestock. This is a perfect display of the short-sightedness of the capitalists. Germany would default on its reparations payments to France. France relied on those payments to repay its debts to Britain and America, and the whole thing would come crashing down. France would respond by deploying 60,000 troops to occupy the Ruhr, which is the industrial heartland of Germany. It holds most of its steel and coal industry, which is why they occupied it. And in response, the German capitalists would engage in unbridled economic warfare against the working class. They would print an unprecedented amount of money in a deliberate attempt to devalue the German mark, which would make debt payments repayable at the expense of hyperinflation and possibly the deepest crisis which any advanced capitalist country has ever experienced. In 1914, before the start of World War I, the US dollar was worth about 4 German marks. On January 1923, a few days before France and Belgium invaded, the dollar was worth about 8,000 German marks. And in November of 1923, 1 US dollar was worth more than 4 trillion German marks. Nearly the entire population was living in total poverty. The middle class was ruined, any form of social security had collapsed, and German society would break down from starvation. The only ones to escape absolute destitution were the big capitalists who would rake in astronomical profits. Their exports were sold in stable currency, while their wages were paid in the German mark, which was totally worthless because prices would double every couple hours at this point. Anger spread like wildfire. Mass demonstrations and street fighting exploded all across Germany. At this point, the ruling class was split over what to do next. The working class was searching for a way forward. The middle class was destroyed and looking towards the workers' parties. This is maybe the most favorable period for socialist revolution so far, and the perfect opportunity for the KPD to show the way forward, calling for the occupation of factories, the introduction of workers' control over production, and the spreading of workers' militias, which already existed in some forms at this point. A wing of the party called for these demands and begun preparations, but the leadership hesitated. The leadership was fundamentally scared of repeating the mistakes of the March action, so they called off any preparations. They canceled them. Zinoviev would push this line, saying, "Germany is on the eve of the proletarian revolution. This does not mean the revolution will come in a month or in a year. Perhaps more time will be required, but in the historical sense, Germany is on the eve of proletarian revolution." Like, this is absolutely ridiculous. Zinoviev said this while mass demonstrations were organized in every major city in Germany. The KPD's membership was skyrocketing, and society was totally breaking down under the weight of inflation. The Comintern would eventually realize the potential of the situation, and get this, create a committee to investigate the planning of an insurrection in Germany. This committee would actually recommend that Trotsky be sent to Germany to lead the coming revolution, but this was, of course, unacceptable to Zinoviev and Stalin, who couldn't let Trotsky get any more influence within the Comintern. At this point, tactical preparations for the insurrection moved quickly. The KPD armed itself, drew up battle plans. The best soldiers of the revolution would go underground, leaving their factories, changing their names, camped out in safe houses, studying maps. But political preparations lagged behind. The party had dragged its feet, realizing the revolutionary potential of the situation, and once again would try to spark a mass revolt themselves. The National Conference of Factory Committees was targeted in October. This was a mass grouping of a bunch of trade union leaders and Soviet leaders from all over the country. This was targeted as the best tool to get the masses to move. The KPD were certain that they could spark a general strike from above. This conference would have 500 labor leaders from all over the country, but was still dominated by the SPD. The labor leaders were terrified of the prospect of reaction to any action that they would take, and so vetoed even calling a vote on a general strike. Instead, they would organize, you guessed it, a commission of the SPD and KPD to investigate the proposal of a general strike. Once again, the reformists had totally outmaneuvered the communists. The KPD had no alternative plans, so it would call off the insurrection. The government troops would easily take control of the communist strongholds, and the revolution would crumble. The KPD was totally dogmatic in their approach to tactics. They started with an ultra-left and one-sided theory of the offensive, and then moved into united front work, which was a good tactic, but the leadership of the KPD and the Comintern were unable to adapt to events. It is incredibly hard for any party to make the transition from propaganda and agitation to the fighting for the direct seizure of power. This is not an easy thing, but it's also necessary. And the KPD's mistake wasn't just a misappraisal of the situation, but was a fundamental failure in method. The KPD would justify calling off the insurrection by blaming the working class for not being ready to fight. Zinoviev would blame the KPD leadership for being unprepared, and the KPD would be forced underground and would continuously lose members from now on. After 1923, the KPD would be transformed from a revolutionary party into a puppet for the Stalinist bureaucracy, and this would mark the end of the German Revolution. The German economy was soon rebuilt with an influx of American capital. Hitler and the forces of fascism would still be on the fringes of German society at this point, but would be a knife in the back pocket of the German capitalists. And in 1929, the American stock market would crash, signaling the start of the Great Depression. America would withdraw its investments from Germany, and the country would experience its second economic and social catastrophe. After countless defeats and betrayals, the German working class was exhausted and the left was in disarray. There was little resistance to when Hitler and the Nazis would rise to power with the full backing of the German capitalists. And Trotsky said that Bolshevism is not a doctrine, but a system of revolutionary training for the proletarian uprising. That is the whole of Hegel, the wisdom of books, and the meaning of all philosophy. There were countless failures throughout the course of the German Revolution, but I think in some way they all find their roots in the failure to train a force of Marxist cadre before the revolution broke out. The Spartakists were disorganized and untrained in the outbreak of the revolution in 1918. The murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and the inexperience of the KPD would allow ultra-leftism and eventually Zinovievism to thrive within the party. And in 1923, the short-sightedness and hesitation would shatter the chances for socialist revolution in Germany. You are in this party to train for situations like these. We are living through a revolutionary epoch and have the foresight to prepare for the immense struggles that will be fought by a class that is not fully aware of its power. There will be no clear battle lines. There will be retreats and advances, victories and defeats. And it is our task to learn from history, to generalize the experience of revolutionary struggle, and use that experience as a weapon in the fight for socialism. Thanks.
Communists of America is a podcast produced by our party, the Revolutionary Communists of America. If you agree with what was said in this podcast and you want to get organized, go to communistusa.org/join